yes. So Kathy, thank you very much for coming in, doing your presentation. I know there was a little bit of a time zone issue, but we had to have you. We have to get your views and insights into mediation in Canada. So please, you'll have to introduce yourself and then take it from there. And I'll come in when you ask me to come in.
Perfect. Thanks, Vikram. So, and yes, of course, ask questions anytime, and I won't be able to see the chat. So if questions come into the chat, then feel free to interrupt and ask them. So my name is Kathy Porter. I'm a chartered mediator with Alternative Dispute Resolution Institute of Canada. I've been mediating for some 20 odd years. Mostly I do multi-party mediation. But a couple of years ago, I went back and did a Master of Design at the Ontario College of Art and Design. And so, and this is the title of it that you can see on the screen, Splitting Rocket, Laughing Falls, Drawing Creative Consciousness into Social Justice Mediation. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I have to apologize because I may be reading some of my notes because I don't have it all memorized. So, and what you'll see in this presentation is a blending together of research and text, and then also some little sketches and drawings. That's a little COVID bird down there in the corner. Some of my research is really an attempt to open the doorway to new pathways in the practice of mediation for both practitioners and participants seeking social justice. In my research, I've drawn on the work of Leanne Bedesamoki-Simpson, who's an Indigenous author and scholar here in Canada. I've drawn on the work of, and she brings to the table that specific Indigenous knowledge that, as a mediator in Canada, I feel that if you're doing work in as I've done, for example, in the fossil fuel sector and in other areas, it's important to have an understanding of Indigenous perspective if, in fact, what we are doing is seeking social justice. I've also looked at Chela Sandoval's work. She's a scholar. Her work is on the methodology of the oppressed. She looks at how language can be interpreted in different ways. So I'll discuss that a little bit. And of course, I will refer to some of the work of Ken Cloke, and I'm not going to go into that very much because I know Vikram has spoken at length with Ken, and many of you who come here will be much better served by going directly to Ken rather than listening to me. In my research, I also interviewed mediators, both in North America and in Europe, just to find out how they might be using creative techniques and imagery, poetry, etc., in their practice of mediation. So that was fun, and it's one of the things that brought me back to Mediators Beyond Borders International, which I'm also an active member. So now I get to push this button to make that slide go forward, and this button to make that next slide go forward, I hope. And it's not. So fiddlesticks, just a minute, I have to figure this out, because my notes are on that next page, but let's go to the next page here, maybe that works. So this was my research question: how arts-based techniques influence the intention to act as a transformative agent in the service of social justice. And now I'm going to still try to find my notes and open them again. Here we go. Okay. And so for me, as for many mediators, I'm sure, mediation is about relationship, the capacity to support others, to help them possibly transform their thinking, to transform their relationship, to gather deeper understanding about the issue that they've come to talk about. My role, of course, is to hold the space for that question and to offer genuine regard for their perspectives. And understanding the difference between settler colonial and Indigenous perspectives means we must also recognize that, and this isn't just in Canada, of course, this is Indigenous populations around the world. It's important to understand that there were other governance and laws in place that are different from the Western social justice system that predominates in the world today, and that predominates even in the world court. And yet there are other perspectives out there that don't often get drawn. So I also wanted to look at, were there other ways to communicate? We use spoken word, we use information in written word form, but are there other ways to communicate information? And of course, the answer is yes, there are. We know that that art evokes emotions, brings images to mind, whether it's poetry or performance theater, or even silly little sketches like I've included here. I think I began, and I may have talked about this in my other conversation with Vikram, but I began my career using collaborative games, understanding that through the physical body, we can also gather information and we can communicate information. And so I began many years ago using collaborative games in an international setting to help people understand what was needed in order to collaborate, which is also an important part of collaboration. Oh, I think I wasn't supposed to do that. Oh, there we go. Let me get to the next slide here. Great, wrong projector. I'm sorry, this is going to be a little bit of a rocky ride till I figure myself out here.
One option is that I can request for the remote control and I can put the slides. I can move the slides from here. If you just
no, I can move the slides from here easily, but I've got my other computer going, which is where my notes are. So I'm looking at, you know, this idea of communicating beyond words, and you know, the interesting thing was I've done a mediation, for example, where I had two parties at the table, and they'd previously been friends, but they were in a shared workplace. They'd come into significant conflict, and neither of them wanted to work with each other anymore. And on the second day of the mediation, they came to the room, and both of them wanted to quit the mediation. So I managed over a course of time to convince them to stay in the mediation, and we slowly worked our way forward. And then I gave them each piece of paper and a box of crayons, and I said, okay, so given the theme that seems to keep coming up that you're talking about, I want you to take 5 minutes each and begin to draw something that represents that theme. And it was quite enlightening to see what happened for them, because they began to draw, and it was like kids in kindergarten playing with the crayons and drawing little things on the paper. And all of a sudden they started to talk. They started to talk about what they were drawing without any comment from me. They started to laugh. They started to reflect on their personal history. They started to come together and identify shared themes and shared interests. And as a result of bringing in that drawing as an intervention, they were able to come up with an agreement that they could both live with. So I was curious to see, you know, how other mediators and what the research was saying about these kinds of tools in mediation. And of course, you know, we've used imageries, as we know, looking at petroglyphs and pictographs from peoples who lived millennia ago, communicating information about wayfinding and other ways to move around in the world. So these are some of the things I looked at. Let's press that button again. Okay, so I wanted to see about how we could understand the meaning beneath the words. And from that perspective, I also dug into Chela Sandoval's work, where she's talking about how words themselves can have different meanings, and so I began to explore some of her work and reflect as I went through this work, I also reflected on my experience as a mediator, working with people from different cultural backgrounds, different castes, different classes, different world views and experiences, to see how mediation can help parties create a shared sense of meaning about issues that they're discussing. Oopsie, here I go again. Next one. Poetry, as I mentioned, is also a way. So in my work, I also integrated some of the poetry that I had written, again, as a way to make these creative techniques accessible to people, because in my experience, lots of people are not interested in identifying that they're in conflict, not interested in identifying that they're in disagreement, and nor are they interested in demonstrating any creative skills, however basic, such as shown in my little sketch here, or in my simple poetry. Just using these techniques to make people comfortable. And so I've had lots of fun in mediations over the years, having people sketch things when they didn't think they could sketch, and through those sketches being able to share significant understanding, and also using images with a scientific background, using scenario planning, computer-generated scenario planning tools to demonstrate in the oil sands, for example, the impact on a large 6 by 12 foot poster, seeing the change of the number of oil plays on the landscape and how those moved off the landscape, and getting people to engage in creating stories around those images has been very impactful in some of my work over the years. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time going back to Chela Sandoval's work for a few minutes, because I think from a social justice perspective, these are some of the key themes, some of the key ideas that we see in social justice. And yet, as we can see in these images, there can be two different perspectives on what these mean. And so I refer to what I call the privileged perspective, or the colonizer perspective. And as a white, Anglo-Saxon woman raised in the United States and Canada, I've been brought up to think about these things from a privileged point of view. And yet there are other ways to look at these. So the first one, and we see this term very common in social justice work, equal rights. But what does this really mean? So from a privileged perspective, what it means is we're all the same on the inside, and yet there's this little thing, but you and I are different. From what Sandoval calls the differential perspective, is that equal rights is a demand for, in fact, rights that are equal, and that this is one form of decolonizing. And then another term that we're probably pretty comfortable with and have seen is the term supremacist. And so from a privileged perspective, we might say, for example, Trump, the former president of the United States, is a white supremacist. And we can see this perspective reflected in groups like the Proud Boys, and the perspective is we are better than you, and so we have dominion over you. And we can see this reflected in the colonizer approach to taking over countries around the world, including India. But the differential perspective looks at it a little bit differently. It says our knowledge is profoundly different, which is what I was talking about when I talked about laws at the beginning of this presentation, that communities have laws, but they have perhaps a different basis. And it's not based on enclosure, authoritarian power, and a hierarchy. So we can see, and again, the reason I look at this is because in mediation, we are often looking at these two different perspectives and even more when we're sitting at the table. The other one is the separatist one. We have a lot of this history of this in Canada. And again, from the privileged perspective, the example here is the Proud Boys who argue for their superiority over others. And the differential from an Indigenous perspective is that our knowledge keepers, our knowledge is profoundly different and based on a connection to the land that is based on community, and that both the trees and the other living beings that are there on the land have equal rights to be there, as do we, and so we live in harmony with those others. Then I want to move a little bit to other forms of artivism, art as activism. And I'm just sharing a couple of these images here. The one on the left is, both of these images are from the works of an Indigenous artist and activist, Chief Ladybird. The one on the right with the red hand is about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a genocide that has occurred and continues to occur in Canada against Indigenous women and girls. They're murdered, and even when they go missing, there's a great reluctance to even think that somebody should go looking for them, in particular the police. And so this image is about the patience that's needed to be able to find answers to these difficult questions. And the image on the left is the Parliament buildings of Canada in the background, and just drawing attention to the Indigenous ways of knowing, the relationships with water, and in some ways a vision of the future that in fact Indigenous ways of knowing are listened to, and they're able to stop making the water sticky. And Canada has a long history of allowing toxic water to go unaddressed for decades and decades on Indigenous lands. This is Sandra Lalonde. I saw her perform a couple of years ago at a seminar I was participating in, and she uses dance to talk about Indigenous histories, Indigenous ways of knowing, and we use performance. Augusto Boal is probably the best known in the world for drawing attention to conflicts and bringing people into an awareness of the conflict through performance theater. And then the final piece I want to talk about is the work of Sohil Inala, who did his work in Taiwan. And this is an approach to using storytelling to consider different ways of looking at story, and storytelling is also a common and informative tool used in mediation, perhaps predominantly in family mediation, but in other kinds of mediation as well. But this approach is used particularly to look at the problem. And often we have that sort of, you can think of that as the headline in the newspaper. This is what the problem is. And everybody kind of adopts that as that is in fact the problem. But in this approach, we have to look at, what are those underlying causes? What are the historical facts? What are the geographic facts? And we begin to craft a story around those causes. And then we look a bit historically and we talk about, well, what's the worldview on the problem? And we could use climate change as an example. I happen to be rather involved in that at the moment. And from here, we sort of begin to parse out the paradigms and the mental models and to look at what the cultural and the values are from a broad perspective. And climate change is a good example because for many, many years, scientists have been warning about the alteration of the Earth's climate on a global scale, and yet much of the worldview was, oh well, it's in the future, we don't particularly need to worry about it, and that has perhaps been influential in people's resistance to addressing what is becoming clearly a climate catastrophe. And then at the metaphor and myth level, this is where we look at the bigger story. We look at, what are the archetypes, what are the emotional responses, what are the kinds of metaphors that are being used to describe the problem. And from here, we can then begin to craft a new story that goes up from the iceberg to reframe the problem, looking at it from a different perspective. So in terms of using climate change again as an example, we could say that climate change is something that's happening in some parts of the world, but we don't really need to worry about it too much. Yeah, we got fire somewhere and drought somewhere, but oh well. To this is a global problem that we are all talking about, and we need to in fact begin to work together, and so we can create a new story using these techniques. So some of the things I learned from my research was that we can use both words and images, and these are languages that share meaning, that help to control the discourse, as in Sandoval's work, that we can use images to communicate intent and share feelings, and we can also use those to create new ideas and to solve, in fact, very complex issues. And that's then reflecting on my role as a mediator. I think it's important to begin to really take maybe a more proactive approach to the idea that we must self-consciously reflect about what our role. And in some ways, this speaks to Ken Cloke's omnipartial, perspective, that we are biased in favor of all parties, and yet we all have biases. We're all indoctrinated into different cultures, and these do play a role in mediation, and in ways that it's important for us to be aware of. And that as mediators, many mediators are trained within the legal system, and the role there is predominantly adversarial, and so mediators not trained in legal backgrounds perhaps come with a different kind of power disguise, if you will, as do the parties. And so we need to unpack that and explore what's going on at the table. And we need to be willing to negotiate beyond the ways we are bound and unbounded by each other. So again, that means drawing in those other ways of creating sense, creating meaning making among parties to the mediation. And finally, this is one of my favorite quotes from the Buddhist nun, a Canadian Buddhist, well, she lives in Canada, Buddhist nun, Pema Chodron. We can stop struggling with what occurs and see its true face without calling it the enemy. It helps to remember our spiritual practice is not about accomplishing anything, but about ceasing to struggle. And so that's my brief presentation of my research, my thoughts, my experience as a mediator in a little nutshell for this presentation. So happy to entertain any questions.
So Kathy, thank you very much. And this is actually very interesting. And I think we need a much larger, maybe a presentation or a lecture, because I'm starting a lecture series from October. So they have a specific lecture on this aspect. But I think this is really important. I mean, it's a different way of looking at mediation itself. And of course, generally about solving a lot of problems. But I think, of course, colonization is discussed as, I mean, I keep saying this, that the effects on dispute resolution, forget the other larger things. We can't undo colonization, it's happened. But we have to undo the psyche that has changed, or the psyche that exists. How do we do that? I mean, I still feel that we need to discuss this.
I agree 100%. And, I think that we have to recognize, excuse me, to start with, that colonization is ongoing. At first, it was, you could say that out of Africa, colonizers came and moved into Spain, into Southern Europe, throughout the Mediterranean. In China, colonizers moved across the Great Plains. So there's a huge focus on Western European colonizers who moved into North America, and the understanding that it was the terra nullius that was in fact untrue. There were estimates range from up into the millions of people living in North America at the time of Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery. And this is the area, in fact, you ask an interesting question, Vikram, because it's the area that we need to consider very carefully when we look at using Western law to settle disputes, because the purpose of Western law is very clearly to protect property, to protect land. And the role that the colonizers plays was to go and grab land so that they could have access to the resources. When first negotiations, mediations, if you will, occurred between Native Americans or inhabitants of Turtle Island and Western European colonizers, that the negotiation was assumed to be between two sovereign states. And then unilaterally, Western European legal, let's call them legal beavers for lack of another word at the moment, decided that because some of these populations, and not all of them, moved around, they weren't in fact sovereign states. They weren't in fact nations. And so then the tenor of negotiations took on a much more one-sided perspective, and the land was suddenly available for the taking in the name of some foreign crown overseas. And of course, the same thing occurred in Africa. And, we know that some of those countries came out from under their colonizers' rule, but unfortunately acquired a lot of the same techniques. And now what we see happening in Africa, as the resources there are plundered, we see the Chinese state moving in and doing exactly the same kind of behavior that the colonizers, the Western European colonizers, used, in that they make big deals for infrastructure, but they bring in all of their own people to work on those infrastructure projects with the intent of extracting the necessary resources that they need to keep their economy going. So I don't see an easy answer right now, Vikram, other than the fact that perhaps we need to go back to a more tribal mentality, and we have to focus on fixing things from a very, very local level. And
yeah. No, please. No, interestingly, work is being done on that, and I keep telling everyone to watch the session of James from Kenya. He's actually doing that. He's strengthening the dispute resolution systems, the traditional ones, of course, sensitizing them also into the changes that have happened. You cannot stick to the decide for them attitude, but he's wanting to keep that community concept together, and it seems to be working. So I think a lot of work on that has to happen, and people like that who are actually doing it. So what I'm thinking now is that you have these, based on what has happened, what we discussed in the symposium, have these action groups. So let's look at one which is going to be just on strengthening the traditional systems. And I keep repeating the fact that David Shimoni has worked on it from Israel. He's worked on, I don't know whether you saw that, but what he's done is basically there were Jews who moved from the Balkans into Israel. So he studied their system of dispute resolution internally, how they're going about it. So basically they, of course, the maximum, took a little survey, maximum of the, well, most of them, of course, respected the rabbi, looked at the rabbi for it. So of course, that telling them what to do was one aspect of it. But what he's come out with the model, he called the hybrid model, that a traditional dispute resolution person and a modern one, they come together for co-mediation. and then they take care of what the trust is there, so they bring the trust. If the voice of some people is not part of that process in the traditional system, the modern one gets that part of it in that. So it's an interesting concept. I
Mhm.
think we should try that. I mean, it should be something that should be looked at. There are people who say on the other side that, will these traditional people let these people come in first of all, and will they listen to them? I think with James' experience, they will. It's happening, so he's doing it.
Yep. Yep.
So I think
That's fantastic. I think restorative justice it came from those kinds of roots, from the Maori
yeah.
practice of bringing both parties together within community. You know, I think communities used to be very powerful places for disputes to be resolved, and certainly we have the Quaker approach and many others. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
No,
I'd love to hear
interestingly,
other perspectives. Yeah.
no, because you said restorative justice. Now in Kenya, what happened was, there was a particular, in a community, the murder took place. So the traditional concept of these people coming together and then working out the system that, okay, the person will give some 15 camels to the other party, whatever that, they'd settled that. Now the matter, of course, the police took it to court, and it's a murder, so it has to be tried as a murder. No one came. No one came, no witnesses came. So the judge sent people to the community to find out what the community had decided. The person came back with that. He passed an order based on that and said, this traditional system, we will recognize it. And from the constitution says that the traditional methods and that culture needs to be, I mean, it is in a way protected or has to be looked at. And based on that constitutional thing, there's an order now. There's a judgment in the court, from the court, saying that. So now that again strengthens it. So we have to look at that. Maybe look,
Mhm.
I looked at our constitution. There is a aspect of the culture to be maintained with communities. So I think there is even sanctity to it. The interesting part is
Mhm.
that, and that should be looked at. If it's not there, say in Canada, maybe if it's not there, maybe they can start looking at, you can start looking at that. Can it be, it's not something that just happens there. We
Mhm.
wanted to move into society in general. Let's see, there, of course, there will be resistance. No one wants people to be empowered enough to do things within themselves. That's the whole colonizers viewpoint.
But you know, there are, you know, controls in all communities. You know, we look at Sharia law, for example, is a way of one community to control the population that they feel they have power over or ought to have power over. And so you're right; these are very challenging and, in fact, delicate kinds of conversations to have, for sure.
Because I think what has happened is that the structure that the colonizer gave was something, of course, I keep saying that in India, 5,000 bureaucrats could, in a way, rule over 300 million people because of this legal structure that they got in. So the next people who took it from them, we might have got independence, but that whole structure it was taken from there. So today, our Indian Penal Code is 1860. The Civil Procedure Code is 1908. Can you imagine? We got independence in 1947, just to tell you
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
so
yeah.
so these things were carried on because the discretion that the judiciary got in the Civil Procedure Code was required by the colonizer, because you had to show that, yes, we're putting a structure in, we've got laws for you, but let's keep all the discretion for us. The judge has
Yes.
everything discretion. So that is what, of course, that discretion goes into backlog because the cases don't get decided. A lot of things that go around that. So I think to undo that, I think some people who can undo it or maybe can change laws are the ones who are taking advantage of it. So how will
Yes.
that happen? I mean,
Yes. I don't know. I think you know, education plays a role, and when we have uh, communities that um, where the political system or the religious system controls the nature of education, and we don't teach children how to think critically or to be curious or even to be creative, we're losing some human competencies here.
yeah.
I don't know how to get them back.
No, but tell me now, if you live in a small place. So now let's start from there. Now, within that community, dispute resolution, is there a concept internally? Is there some structure? Is it something that, I mean, has it been looked at, discussed?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've looked at it. I mean, I think one of the things that happens in this community is that there's a Facebook page. Now, I could go on about Facebook, but let's not push that button tonight, um, or this morning. And so on that page, people express their conflicts. They are abusive towards other people in the community, and yet there's no checks and balances there. I mean, you can go online and you can make a comment in another direction if you're careful about it, but there's no way for people for anybody to sort of slow down that very toxic process that's going on. This is, for me, one of the challenges of that kind of social media, and yet social media also has its benefits in terms of perhaps waking people up to the fact that there are really radically different perspectives in the community that with which I, for example, might disagree quite vehemently. So that's one of the tools, but there's no sort of um, mediator presence, let's put it that way, to say, well, wait a minute, let's instead of jumping all over this person, let's step back and think about how we might creatively solve this problem together. Something I think about often, but when you figure it out, Vikram, please let me know.
Because that's exactly what I want to figure out, because that's where it's going to start. That's exactly where it's going to start. It's not going to be something which is suddenly going to happen one go and something. It's going to start in communities. And luckily, you are in a small community. So the issues involved, look, interesting thing that came up from Andrea. She's an Ireland. She lives in a village, a small village. Let's a village. Yes, it is a village. So 6,000-7,000 people. So I was asking her, so do you work with the people as a mediator? She's an interesting thing. She says, look, in the same community, it does not work. So I will not work in the same community because of the social things involved and everything. So that's interesting. But a lot of people in terms of community mediation talk about people from the community. But maybe that's not the wrong approach, because there's a grant from New Zealand. He was saying that the New Zealand government has tried everything to promote community mediation, hasn't taken off. So I was telling him about this, that maybe from the community might not work. So I think these discussions are important. So one, the action group, I think one action group on community mediation, right? So
yeah, definitely. And I think that's mediation has played a role in setting the stage for that too. That the adage for many years that the mediator was this third party neutral who could stand outside of the conflict, and so being in the community kind of goes against that, as do lots of other things. So I think it depends on the community. The community has to be, I think, to go and use the tipping point idea. There has to be enough people in the community who are willing to either work together or try something different in order for change to happen. And that change is going to look different, as you were saying earlier, given some of the examples. It's going to look different in different communities, and in different cultures.
Yeah, because I think the point is, maybe there is not enough communication happening from one part of the world to the other on terms of experiences, because everything, like I told you, when I heard James his presentation, I understood that there is work happening, and suddenly you find out, and this is exactly what I've been talking about. The whole theme of the symposium was in this direction. And then you find something, even look, one person making a change, and he's doing it over East Africa. So it's not only Kenya, so he's doing it other places. So if it can work there, I think we can start that process. I think it's just what, it doesn't go against anyone. It's not that you're taking away from anything. And look, strengthening communities. Look, this is again a colonial concept of divide and rule. So people should not come together to resolve their disputes. Why should people come together? How does the colonizer rule? So that psyche, that mindset has created issues between people. So you have to bridge that also. So it's not going to happen in a day. I'm not saying it's going to happen in a day. It's going to be work, and a lot of work. But I think if we start looking at it in the right direction, that maybe the solution is going to come from within the community, not a law going to come out on it and this, that. I think we've been too focused on the law doing things for us. I think we have to move away from that, because we
No,
have everything. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing we need to recognize is that governments and legal systems change very, very slowly, whereas things that are happening on the ground and close to where we are and what we're passionate about, those changes can happen much more quickly.
Absolutely. But I've taken you into this direction. You're a design person, and your art and music and dance into mediation. I think let's talk about the nicer things. What have you spread this? I mean, in Canada and otherwise, how have people reacted to it?
Oh, very positively. I mean, I think there are a lot of mediators who are drawing on different creative techniques in their mediation processes, and I just looked at some of them. Um, I think the key thing here is that perhaps we are too, as mediators, as a class, let's say, are too bound by the law, too bound by a specific structure, taking a group of people from A to B. A lot of mediations in Canada are tied up in the law, family mediation, insurance mediation, very tied up in the law. And yet, for me, in some ways, not that I want to go against the law, but in some ways that prevents people from tapping into their creative resources and creative energies. And so, my focus is to move away a little bit from I keep my mediation toolkit in my back pocket, but I bring my design tools to the fore as a way to help people frame the issue that they're working on together, and to learn how to, from practical experience, to collaborate together to solve problems. And does it take sometimes technical and other kinds, scientific, social expertise? Absolutely. So that's what we have to be thinking about when we are moving into a dispute. Are the right people at the table? That's a conversation for another day. We won't go into that one today either. But lots to discuss.
Lots, Kathy, lots. This is that I'm saying that a lot of these conversations have to happen, and you have to do this next symposium with 200 people. You are going to organize and get those conversations going.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. I mean, I was on the board of our BC Arbitration and Mediation Institute to put together a conference earlier this year, and I got to admit, I felt a bit frustrated that we spent so much time on sort of existing structures, and we didn't allow ourselves to think creatively about how mediation itself as a practice might, and in fact, in my perspective, needs to change.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's this one box which has been circulated everywhere. The problem is that box is good. Not just now. This is okay. This is not colonization, but this is one box in one part of the world is being sent everywhere, and I mean the training part of it, everything in that one box. It's not that. There's so much more around it which is getting lost. And I think countries like ours where not much work has happened, I think we have to be careful, because that box is easy to get because, oh, yes, it's worked there. Let's pick it up. But I think people need to dig a little deeper as to what the issues there. And I've been talking about this in the symposium. I've been talking about the US situation, and I've been saying, I mean, basic statistics that I picked up from my Google search, that there are only 400 community mediation centers, only 400,000 matters. That's nothing. 100 million matters going to courts every year. There's a fundamental problem there. The lawyers and everyone on that end, okay, everything is working for them. That's happening. But what about people? I mean, are people, okay, that's again a mindset thing, psyche thing, courts and the focus on that, litigious society. Why do societies develop that way? What are the issues? Are the way people say individualistic societies? I am saying not individualistic societies, selfish societies. Individualistic is too nice a word for it. So selfish societies have developed. What the reasons? I think there is so much around it also which needs to be discussed. It's very simple to pick one thing out of somewhere and say, oh, let's do this, and it has worked there. no,
Yeah,
it hasn't worked. Maybe let's question
yes,
it. Don't take it so easily. So I think those are, I
exactly.
think, questions and all that we ask. But do you want to tell a little bit about mediation in Canada? What's happening on a larger level?
Well, I think that when I look at the organizations that I belong to, I see a predominance of those in the legal profession who are trained in a particular method of mediation that centers around the law. And for me, what that does is it moves the focus of the mediation and the mediator away from the parties and into a system of ownership, protecting property, and it doesn't think inclusively about the parties who are impacted by the mediation, who don't have a seat at the table, who are purposefully excluded from sitting at the table in a meaningful way, and we don't tend to look at this, and so I think as the conversation tomorrow is the first a day of reconciliation, a national holiday in Canada, looking at the Indigenous long history and ongoing history of ongoing occurrence of genocide among perpetrated by the Canadian government against Indigenous people and Indigenous nations. And, as long as we have a legal system that supports the idea of protecting property and protecting individual interests, as opposed to another perspective that protects the community as a whole, including the environmental, the ecosystem within which we live, we're going to struggle in an uphill battle. And I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe an uprising, maybe a revolution. I don't know.
What about my revolution, my dispute resolution revolution? What about that
Yes,
revolution?
yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And
But
I
no one,
think we also have to look at dispute differently, because dispute itself has this very confrontational aspect to it. And yet, if we come with that confrontational mindset, how can we step back and into a place of openness and I don't know.
yeah, I think more into the root of the thing and the much larger things involved. But tell me, this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, what all is it looking at? I mean, is it looking at the people who did it, and do they even ask them why you did it? What is your mindset? What was your mindset at that time? I would be interested to know that, because if you want to change things, you have to understand who the person who did it, I mean, or the people who did it.
Yeah, and I think among the predominant uh, class of people in Canada, there's a lack of interest, a lack of knowledge. And so I think what we are beginning to see finally and slowly, and perhaps thankfully because of COVID, people waking up to the fact that there's some very uncomfortable history here in Canada, of children being taken from their families and put into residential schools. That's the T-shirt I'm wearing today.
Every child matters.
Every Child Matters, which came about as a result of the broader Canadian community finally being made aware of the number of children who died and were buried without any names. Sorry, there's a spider going across the computer screen here. Without any recognition, and that these are unmarked graves are being uncovered. 200 small bodies, 700 small bodies in unmarked graves. And this hasn't occurred in Canada only, of course. I mean, these unmarked graves existed in Ireland, for example, and in many other places around the world. So it's a reckoning with a history that is quite different from the one that we learn in school about, these amazing explorers coming and discovering this country and trading with the Indians, and all of that kind of nonsense. And at the same time, displacing peoples who had lived there for centuries from their land in order to take ownership of that land and extract the resources without any idea of compensation or what we might consider a fair negotiation.
I really want to understand what goes in that mind to do that to a child. I mean, my little introduction to this was there's this TV series called Anne with an E. So there was this aspect of this child being taken from the community, and Anne goes out looking for the child. So that's when I saw that this, I mean, not the, I mean, the best way to be introduced to all this. People do read history and read these things. I don't, so maybe this was my introduction to it. But these are serious things that happened, and why people do it, and this stuff. I'm just telling you the mindset behind it, which I think in most crimes done, that is an issue which is obviously discussed. But this kind of a thing where, I mean, for what? I think we have to start discussing those things.
Well, I think one of the reasons that it occurred was that the I'm going to call them colonizers, for lack of a better word right now, the people who were coming to this country when the countries that they were from were running out of resources. They were looking at new places to gather resources, whether it was beaver for fur hats or timber for masts for sailing ships, doesn't matter. The idea was, well, these people that were here, but they didn't think the way they needed to be, and so they were labeled as savages. They were labeled as less than human. There was no thought processes at the time that allowed people to think outside the box, to say, oh, these are other human beings. How interesting. How curious, how are they survived for thousands of years? Instead, there was, I think you said earlier, Vikram, this idea of greed, of wanting to acquire things beyond what we needed for our human lives, food and water.
Exactly. But I mean, the way I'm looking at it is, finally, do we go back to smaller communities? So that's why I keep looking, I'm asking you to do, I mean, you will tell us that smaller communities, what are the issues there? Because if we do say that smaller communities, but if the same issues happen there also, that's even worse, because if a smaller community not getting along together, I think every day looking at each other, but still having issues might be more of a problem. So what is the solution?
Well, and small communities don't exist in isolation. You know, they exist within a bigger community and a bigger culture and a bigger society. And we have, over the years, we have established geopolitical boundaries. I'm using that as a royal we, I guess. But geopolitical boundaries have been established, and rules put in place to, in some ways, to enable people to live together. But we also have to think that, you know, if the rule of law is intended to find a balance, it's working in ways that continue to be unbalanced. And we tend to think of issues in isolation rather than looking at issues from a systemic perspective. And so perhaps, you know, what we can bring to the conversation as to whether it's a community, it could be a community in an apartment building, you know, it could be a community on a block, but those communities exist within bigger communities, and information and other things flow in and out of those things. But if we take the opportunity, and it's hard work to look at these challenges from a systemic issue, and look at the systems that perpetuate situations, and these situations either get worse or break down, you know.
Because I think what goes against me is that I don't read books. Mahatma Gandhi wrote some books on, one of his concept was self-sufficient villages. So he's written a book on that, which obviously it's not too thick, but it's lying there for years. One day I want to read that, because I felt maybe that is one way of going about it. Let's create self-sufficient communities. Well, maybe for an experiment, let one community, if you're saying that the external influences this, for the moment, let's cut off from the external. Can they do it? Let's see. We can talk to a community. Let's see what are the issues that come up in that, when you're totally within yourself, you're taking care of everything yourself. How do when does that conflict start there? What really and what takes it forward. It's not influenced by politics. It's not influenced by the divide and rule. But there will be divide and rule there also, because you'll have to say, okay, administratively, someone is going to run it, then politics starts. And so those issues start. So I think maybe we should, of course, discuss how we can, a whole concept works together without some person being in charge or in control. I think that is where the problems start when you say, and then is it through respect of elders? Because if you look at dispute resolution from these communities, we are talking about respect for elders or respect for the clergy somewhere, respect for the whatever, whoever else it could be. So maybe is that the way to get people forward? Because biggest issue is when I look at the world stage and you say that you can, is there any head of government that people in this world trust to resolve their disputes? Because what mirrors a community is what is mirrored on this world stage. I mean, these are people who come out from communities only. So I think if we start with the world stage, yes, is going to take time. But if in these communities we can work out a system that the people who are respected are the ones who are taken forward as their leaders, instead of other people who can make the noise and can divide people, and they are the ones who go forward. So maybe our structure of doing it is incorrect.
Maybe. So I hear you say you don't read, but there's a very interesting book called The Pluriverse. I'll send you a copy. I've got a PDF.
No, it's not going to happen, Kathy. what I've done is, from next month, a new series I'm starting. It's called Talking Books. And starts with look, everything I do starts with Ken Cloke. So I'm doing that starting with Ken Cloke. And the byline to that is talking books, because some of us don't read them. that's the byline. So,
but the purpose, the point of this book is that it explores communities around the world and all the techniques that they use for governance, for sustainability, all these different ideas. And they all fall into the different categories I shared: equal rights, supremacists, etc. So we do that. So it's a fascinating book in terms of all the different ways of being in community together that people have created over the centuries.
No, the idea behind the series is that if we can get the author to be part of that discussion. So can we get this author be part of the discussion? Is that maybe can you send me the book? Send me the book. Let's get in touch with the author. No, that is exactly what the idea is. These people,
of course.
Why the author is required is because let's understand the thought process of the author, what situation that person wrote it in. So, and of course, you are going to be part of the discussions. What I'm going to be putting out is that if you've read this book and you want to be part of the discussions, tell me. I'll invite some people on that. So, like Michael Lang, I'm doing on the 21st is Ken Cloke. On the 20, 13, 20, 27th. 9, 16, 23rd. 23rd is Michael Lang on his book, The Reflective Practice. So there is Andrea from Ireland. She's coming in for the discussion because she's, of course, read the book and she's part of part of Michael Lang's that circle, that some discussion thing that they have on reflective practices. So this is what we'll do. So this book you found interesting. Let's call the author. Let's have a discussion on it. I will learn, and this is the only way I learn, because I'm not going to read it. I'll tell you what, I'm a little selfish. Let's say selfish, because I like my eyes, and right now I don't have glasses, and I enjoy the world with. I mean, through a glass, it must be different. I mean, I don't know what it is. You will tell me, but I feel that when I look at the trees directly without a glass in front of me, I like it. I haven't tried it the other way. Although I haven't tried it the other way. So sometimes when you ride a motorcycle, sometimes you wear these plain glasses. It doesn't seem too nice to me. David Shimoni is here. He's done very interesting work on, like I just told you, about the Balkan Jews. So David, you want to tell Kathy about that? Kathy is in Canada. She's done very interesting work on music and art in dispute resolution. You want to come in?
Hi, David.
Yeah. Hi, Kathy. Good morning, and for you, it's a good night, I understand.
Yes.
So, yeah, good night to you. Yeah,
thank you.
I offered a presentation with the subject of how do we introduce modern mediation to traditional cultures.
Yes.
And I reviewed three prevalent strategies of dealing with this subject, and I offered a fourth. And the fourth is having a modern mediator co-mediate with a grassroots leader. And I actually practiced this method, and I presented a case in which I did it with a very important rabbi of the specific community I was investigating at the time. It's Jews that came to Israel from Uzbekistan with their own mixture of a Muslim country and ex-communist country and the Jewish tradition and their own specific ways of dealing with conflicts and their own dignitaries who perform conflict resolution.
But tell me,
Very
David,
interesting.
are you okay with repeating what you just said? What I'm going to do is I'm going to end Kathy's session and start that other session that I put up, that is discussion on the key takeaways and the learning from the symposium. So let's do that. It's okay, Kathy, because that will be something that people will look at separately, and what David did was part
Wonderful.
of that. So not taking away from the fact that I love discussing things with you. It's always a pleasure talking to you, but we are going to be talking in November. We're going to have that discussion, that conversation going. So that I hope you've put the time right. That is the important thing.
Yes, I'll get the time right next time for
Okay,
sure.
but you can just put it there at 6:30 a.m. your time on 20th November.
Okay.
And this is on record. David has heard it. People who are watching it or will watch it have heard it. So when you don't land up, I will put it live and say, Kathy's not here. I will scold her.
Maybe I'm asleep at 6:30 in the morning. Who knows?
I'm sorry, you don't have
I
that
will
choice.
do my best to have coffee beforehand. Very good.
So,
anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Vikram.
Yeah, you're
wonderful.
staying here. Staying here. We're just ending this session
Okay.
and we're starting that.
Perfect.
So thank you very
Okay.
much. Always a
Great.
pleasure. And we have to take this forward.